A couple things I want to talk about today dealing with Europe in the 19th century after Napoleon. Waterloo was the main event by which everything was measured after 1815. You will not have another major war. After 5 major wars within a century, you will not have another major war for another full century. That is it's amazing. You have from 1814 or 1815, no major war until 1914. That's 99 years and 6 months later, you will have World War I. In between, you're going to have a number of small wars, very localized wars. You're going to have revolutions that take place, resulting in some conflict. But the issue is no major wars. The reason that Europe avoided it, you think maybe they had learned something, we're not sure what they ever learned, but at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe formed what is known as the Concert of Europe, the Concert of Europe. It consisted of 5 of the major powers that had involved in the Great Napoleonic Conflict. The powers being Russia, Austria, Prussia, which becomes Germany, Great Britain, and France. The idea of the concert is that every European power will operate in concert with one another, in harmony with one another. No unilateral action ever again. No single power will be allowed to attack its neighbor without reprisal from the other 4 powers. In order to guarantee that, they set up what's called, I don't know if any of this works. Always bring it down. Probably not. Oh, good. Jeez, it actually works. This works. They never work. Concert of Europe. Okay. It meets at Vienna. It's known as the Congress of Vienna, where all this is decided. You're going to have coming out of that quadruple alliance, which means 4-party alliance. And the Holy Alliance. Okay. The idea that no power will ever have to take unilateral action is going to be maintained by the spirit of the Concert of Europe. Anytime there's a major conflict that occurs, they meet someplace. They don't always meet in the same location, but the concert will meet first place it meets is the Congress of Vienna, but they're going to meet in Troppau, they're going to meet at Liebeck, they're going to meet at Constantinople. So, and they're still using the term, the name Constantinople. Europeans refuse to ever call Istanbul, Istanbul. They always keep calling it Constantinople. Okay, whatever. But out of this, you've got to have a military arm of the European concert is known as the Quadruple Alliance. And that is, if there is a major revolution, particularly a nationalist revolution, with the spirit and the idea of the French revolutionary concept of nationalism attached to it, it's got to be put down. We can't allow this to ever happen again. We cannot allow another French revolutionary ideology to spread across Europe, overthrow kings, get rid of nobles, just tear up the entire European frame. It can't happen. So we have four powers that are going to be part of the maintenance of general European peace at all times. France, Britain, Prussia, and Russia. Later, Prussia will simply become known as Germany. But France, Russia, Prussia, and Germany. France, Russia, Prussia, and England, I'm sorry. And it's up to the closest power to the conflict to send their military in. It's not like the United Nations where you have everybody in a UN army from all over the place thrown into a conflict, which, by the way, doesn't usually work anyway, but sometimes, once in a while, it does. But basically, it's the country with the large army closest to the conflict that is requested to send its military in to prevent problems. Okay, you're going to have some revolutions occur very early after 1815 that are going to require that kind of intervention. It's an active intervention. It's military. And it takes place about 6 times in the next 30 years. But then also you have the Holy Alliance, which was designed by Tsar Alexander I of Russia. It's his point of view that Europe should be run along certain kinds of beneficent Christian lines, that Europe should operate under Christian principles. And this is a very odd alliance. Because what does that mean? That's the problem. What does that mean? And so the 3 countries that signed on to it were Russia, of course, because of Alexander, Tsar of Russia, and Prussia, and Austria. These are the 3 autocratic powers. France never signed on to it. They didn't understand it. Great Britain did not sign on to it because they really sort of thought, well, you know, I want to be nice, but I just don't know where this is going to go. To this day, nobody really understands the Holy Alliance. Was it ever used? Not really. It's never really put to work on any particular issue. Why did Tsar Alexander come up with this? Because during the war, during the Napoleonic Wars, Alexander emerged as a hero in the minds of a Christian sect operating in the German states, and they're known as the Moravian Brothers. The Moravian Brothers. Has anybody ever heard of the Moravians? They settled this country too, the Moravians. I was going to say they're kind of like the Amish, only not. Because the Amish have mafia, we know that. There's a program. I can't wait to see these guys. I'm going to kill you with my black hat. Is it Amish mafia? Okay. They'll hit you with a horse and buggy. I used to live in Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, Lancaster. They were all over the place. Those buggies. Well, for me, they're quaint. Who cares? But mafia? I find this one really hard to believe. This is another invention of the history channel, along with ancient aliens. Okay, now, get back to the subject, which I'm usually not on, but I try. This group known as the Moravian Brethren were one of these early evangelical, 19th century early evangelical sects, spelled S-E-C-T-S, that believed in the literal interpretation of biblical prophecies. By that I mean they believed that, especially the big prophecies that show up in the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. The apocalypse is called the apocalypse. That simply means revelation in Greek. But in that setting, you find that the Antichrist is to be challenged and destroyed by the king of the north. You're going, what are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about how biblical prophecy was conveyed in 1800 or so. And that the person who was conceived as the king of the north by the Moravian brothers was Alexander I. And the Russian army was the army that delivered the world from the threat of the Antichrist, who was Napoleon. So you have a reconfiguration of that number 666, the number of the Antichrist, the number of the beast from Revelation, which really spells into, take that literally in Hebrew, it spells out Kaisar Neron, which means Caesar Nero. But you rework that, you get the Caesar who's challenging this, and that's the Tsar Alexander. He's the king of the north. He's challenging the beast. And so he does. Because his army virtually, and the weather, and a couple of good generals, especially one, absolutely devastate Napoleon's army of 612,000. So he's understood as the king of the north. He's understood as a savior. So out of that context, Alexander conceives of the Holy Alliance. In other words, I'm the man. You know, I've done all this. I've beaten Napoleon, and he had a lot to do with it. So out of that comes this view, this apocalyptic view of himself as a savior. And so he now establishes the Holy Alliance based on that reputation. Now that may seem a stretch, folks, but it's not a stretch when you're living in 1815 and you looked at whoever saved you from Napoleon. It was a good job, trust me, and should be rewarded in some fashion. So the problem is that nobody understood what the Holy Alliance really was, what it was supposed to do, but run Europe by Christian principles, whatever those were. And the odd thing is, maybe it's not too odd for the time, but basically Alexander I, who saw himself as this divine person, as the savior, as the deliverer, as the king of the north, was anything but an evangelical Christian himself. He is the head of the Orthodox Church. They're not known to be further evangelical, display at all. But nonetheless, it all kind of fits. It's a strange time. The 19th century is a very strange period. So you have this sort of thing in place. The British really championed this, but the whole system, the whole of the system is called the Metternich system, Metternicch, because it's Count von Metternich, I'll write the name down. Metternich, who was the foreign minister for Austria, it was held in his apartments in Vienna. So the system is called the Metternich system. It's now beginning to peter out here. Count von Metternich. He's the most important political figure in 1815, 1816. Because they're devising all these ways to keep Europe safe, put down any future revolutions and all of it. Metternich is the man that's putting it all together. Now the question is, where does Britain fit in all of this? Britain, of course, is a major contributor to the downfall of Napoleon. They're going to get something out of this. So the first thing, let's just take a look at it and see what they did get out of it. They came out of these Napoleonic wars with an empire twice the size of what it had been before the wars. So let's just stop and pause here and ask a question. Remember, the British had lost the American colonies, which they wouldn't admit was a major loss. But it doesn't really matter, because in the sense that they're going to regain a lot here. But they decided, after the loss of the American colonies, that they didn't really want to get involved in any further colonial acquisition. They said, we're not going to go through this again. We lost these little bastards, the Americans, but we're not going to do this again. This is a big mistake. It cost us a lot. And as well as we lost them, the monetary price was astronomical for this nonsense. And what do we get for it? Nothing but a slap in the face. And they a great deal of resentment about the Americans, about the losses. So this created this very strong anti-imperialist feeling in Britain, with what we call the end of the First British Empire, after the Treaty of 1783 ends it. Okay, the end of the First British Empire. They're not going to mess with colonies again. And as most people that study this material get into it realize, but at the end of the Napoleonic period, right, just what, 20 years later, they have an empire twice as large as they did in 1783. How does it happen that you're so anti-imperialist and you manage to grow like crazy empire? And it's called the creation of the Second British Empire. Well, it comes because of the defeat of Napoleon, and whom Napoleon had conquered. He had conquered the Dutch and a few other groups, and it assumed all their colonies, assumed a ton of territory overseas. So the result was that the British took those territories from the French during the Napoleonic Wars. Like what? South Africa, basically Cape Town, South Africa. Belonged to the Dutch, and then Holland itself was seized by the French during the war. Cape Town, South Africa was then claimed by the French, although never occupied by, but claimed by it. So because it's claimed by the French, the British went after it during the war, and they took South Africa. Colony was Dutch, would have been Dutch South Africa, Cape Town. When the war was over, they didn't give it back. Why? Because it's a strategic colony. Strategic meaning you have a navy of hundreds of ships. This navy has been given a task of patrolling Africa and preventing the slave trade from continuing. Therefore, I have to have a way station where to stop here, and South Africa becomes Britain's way station. Later, that's going to grow into a huge conflict in South Africa between the Dutch and South Africa and the British. When I went to a conference in Istanbul 3 years ago, I met a number of people, conference readers, historians from South Africa. This has got to be the strangest group I've ever met in my life. Some were Brits, some were Dutch Boers still, some were African, and altogether there was a bad mix. They suspected each other, they didn't like each other. It was not, it was not the UN. It was really, really weird. The Dutch guy still spoke the Boer language, the Dutch Boer language, and they spoke that whenever they were around anybody speaking English. And it was just strange. This is like another freaking world. This is like apartheid coming before. It's just strange. It's a strange whole thing. And I mean, you could just feel it. You could just feel it. Well, the Brits acquired South Africa. It's a good way station. It's a strategic. It's called a strategic colony. Later, it's going to become a very valuable colony because of gold and diamonds coming from South Africa. But what the Dutch had done there was also plant a lot of vineyards. It was a way station to pick up wine, vineyards, that they took on their trips all the way to Indonesia. So the Dutch had used it and developed agriculture there, and the British, of course, began to simply pick up on that. Then you had the island of Ceylon, Ceylon, also known as Sri Lanka. I rather call it Ceylon because that's the name that it used at the time, Ceylon. It's like a teardrop island south of India. The British already had a lot of India, 2/3 of India under its control by this time. The island of Ceylon was a choke point in the Indian Ocean between being in the West Indian Ocean, East Indian Ocean, and over to the South China Sea. The Dutch had built first the Portuguese, then the Dutch had built a capital there called Colombo. And the island was known for having a big, I'd say, harvest of pearls every year. Very amazing. King George, when the English acquired it, was considered the head of the Buddhist church in Ceylon. That's the title they gave him. This is a strange island, Buddhism. The main population of the island of Ceylon was the Sinhalese, S-I-N-H-I-L-I-S-E, Sin, S-I-N-H-I-L-I-S-E, the Sinhalese population. They're Buddhists, they're pacifists. And when the Portuguese came, they brought Catholicism, and they built churches. And then the Dutch came and they brought the Reformation. They brought the Dutch Reformed Church. And all the while, 90% of the population is Buddhist and has not a clue as to what the rest of the stuff is on the island. And then comes the British, who they took over during the war. And the British now established the Church of England on Ceylon. And so King George automatically becomes the head of the Buddhist church of Sinhalese Buddhists, who have no clue about what any of this is. But it's the strangest thing that George actually took the title. King of Ceylon, King of the Buddhists. King of the Buddhist church, head of the Buddhist church, all right. It's a strategic island, it's got some wealth, but you also had a very distinct minority of Hindus living on the island who could not stand the Buddhists. So if you ever talk about an island that had a chance of some kind of, it's an ecumenical wreck, is what it is. This is not churches all getting along, it's everybody hates everybody in an equal fashion, and it's just a crazy place. Anyway, and it still is. I mean, they were still fighting up until 5 years ago, and a lot of it's calmed down, but it's bizarre. Then the British got picked up Burma, God knows why, today known as what? Myanmar. Okay. Tough place, tough jungles, everything else. But on the border of India, so it's a strategic defense line to defend India from God knows what in the east at that time. We don't know. Nobody was coming to get India from the east, but nonetheless, Britain got it. Then, Sir Stamford Raffles, just 2 years after the end of the war, Raffles, R-A-F-F-L-E-S, decided to seize, there wasn't much to it, on the south tip of the Malaysian Peninsula, another strategic location called, on the Malaysian Peninsula called Singapore. Singapore today is one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's one of the great economic driven cities. It is I had a former, he was going to be my stepson, but never did. I never got married to her. But anyway, he lives there now. He's a banker, and it's just great money coming in. He makes all kinds of bucks, and he keeps inviting me to come to Singapore. I'm going to have to do it. I just got to see it. But it's at the time, there was nothing there. The British government, this time under this is still King George, the last of his reign before he goes totally insane, he urged Parliament to
get these colonies. And when Raffles got back to England to fire him from whatever position he had, he didn't have any official position, so it was something to fire. But just do something, beat the man, do something. We don't want Singapore. Boy, good thing I rethought that later. So by 1818, Singapore is firmly in British hands, but they also claim the entire Malaysian peninsula. Then comes Australia, penal colony. During the wars, there was so much in the way of arrest and repression in England because it had become an intolerable, almost fascist state in trying to fight Napoleon. So the charges against anybody for anything resulted in people being thrown into prisons that were vastly overcrowded, and also into ships known as the prison hulks, H-U-L-K-S. A prison hulk is basically a warship converted into a prison, sitting on the Thames River. Horrible conditions, horrible disease, life expectancy on board one of those things, about 5 years. So what they did is said, okay, look, instead, the judge says, I'm going to give you a sentence here now. You got, caught stealing fruit, and, you're going to be, it's either a prison halt or transportation. Usually the lawyer argued for transportation. Is that a free ticket somewhere? Do you get to go to Vegas? I mean, what is it? It's a ticket to the middle of freaking nowhere, Australia, which nobody knew much about. So that becomes it's transportation colony. When you get a sentence of transportation, it means you're in prison. You're in exile. For good. Gone. Goodbye. So they acquired Australia. In the name of the colony, it's on the south, it's on the southeast, it's called New South Wales. W-A-L-E-S, no H. A lot of people love to spell Wales, W-H-A-L-E-S. But this Wales, W-A-L-E, just W-A-L-E-S. New South Wales. But also a lot of free farmers went along with the prisoners, the prison population. And they're going to build a very distinct society down there. It's going to develop rapidly after they discovered gold in the 1830s and 40s. It's going to have basically a land rush. But ultimately it becomes another one of those colonies that they weren't sure they really wanted again, another white settlement colony. You really want to do this. You know how nasty they can be. Well, not only did they get that one, but within a few years later, because of guys jumping ship to escape the transportation colony sentence, they jumped ship in front of another island. It turned out to be another British island, New Zealand. If you lived long enough, you weren't killed by the Maoris, and you developed a farm or you got something done, then it became a development by English real estate interests with the Wakefield Company, W-A-K-E-F-I-E-L-D, Wakefield Company, just absolutely advertised, go to New Zealand. It was totally against the law. The Queen's government, Queen Victoria, was totally against it. It was outlawed, but they did it anyway, and they finally acquired New Zealand in the 19th century. But these are strategic colonies. 2 of them were white settlement colonies. So altogether, you have this sort of mixed colonial bag out there. It's twice as big as it ever was. And at one point, by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire truly can be said in that the sun never sets on it. It's all over the place. And it consists of basically a quarter of the population of the world and a quarter of the land population. So it's a rather remarkable reversal that what they set out to not ever do or have, this is exactly what they acquired. And nobody knew quite how to do it. And by the time Queen Victoria comes along in 1837, she becomes Queen Victoria, Queen of Great Britain and the Empire, but also Imperatrix, meaning Empress of India. She's going to become an imperial ruler of a real empire that did exist. Britain now has to have a huge navy to protect this empire. So comes the philosophy that developed even earlier, but Britain would always have twice as many ships in her navy as the next two largest navies combined. So she's definitely devoted to this. So the British Empire emerges after the Napoleonic Wars with a vengeance. It also emerges with a task, and the task was put forward by the anti-slavery movement in Britain during the war. And this movement pushed William Pitt the Younger to support it, although he died in 1807. But he's pushing this movement that finally comes to fruition at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and that movement is the anti-slave trade movement. The result is Britain now has a major ban on all slave trafficking coming from mostly the west coast of Africa. From the west coast. Now, there's always been slavery from the east coast, from Zanzibar over to the Gulf and inland, and over to India as well. But it's the West they're talking about, because the West had the most traffic. Even during the war, something like 10,000 slaves a month being taken off the west coast of Africa. Sent to where? Mostly sent to the Americas, to the Caribbean and to the Americas for the sugar plantations. Britain now has the job of stopping that trade using the British Navy to do it. It's an enormous task which they don't seem to welcome or want to do. It's very unrewarding. Nonetheless, it has nothing to do with slavery itself. It's not a ban on slavery. It's a ban on the slave trade, acquisition of new slaves. So that comes into existence again in 1815. And it's the British who have to have the moral fiber and the muscle to do it. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. Now, Britain's foreign policy that emerges following this war is one, first of all, of following this dictum up here, and that is agreeing to the principles of the European concert, no unilateral action at all, ever. We will join any other power to stop anybody else from trying to exercise unilateral action. For instance, that or military prohibition of any rise in nationalism. The fear was, at some point, though we have put down Napoleon, he's in St. Helena, he's going to die in 1821, and the whole thing's over. The problem is the spirit of the nation, the concept of the nation, is not dead. It's still around. Where is it around? It's around in the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks have it. It's around in Central Europe. You have this conflict between the Dutch and the Belgians. It's not called Belgium yet, but the southern part of that territory. Essentially, these are people who speak a different language than the Dutch. They remain Catholic, whereas the Dutch are Reformed. And they have a contract with the British. They're going to sublet a lot of British manufacturing is going to go into Belgium. It's outsourced, and it's going to fall under British protection. That's another one where you're going to have this national movement come about. The Greek national movement, the Belgian national movement. You also have a movement in Latin America among a number of the Spanish colonies. The first to rebel is going to be Mexico itself, but it's going to be followed by a number of other countries very shortly in the 1800s. The question is, what happens with these? Okay, are they going to be supported? These are nationalist movements, perceived as nationalist movement. You cannot legitimately belong to the Concert of Europe and support a nationalist movement. Why? Because it's against the very spirit of the Concert of Europe. Nationalism is considered anathema. It's poison. It's acid. Get rid of it. It's the pestiferous virus of the 19th century. And if it isn't taken out, it's a cancer on Europe. If it's not removed, it's going to devastate the entire European community. That was the belief. That's the traditional belief of the Concert of Europe. That's why the Quadruple Alliance was put in place, to try and enforce any kind of military action to stop the rise of a nationalist movement, no matter where it occurs. So the Brits are totally onto this, they signed on. But the contradiction, the problem we have with the Brits is that while they sign on to this, it's a great dream, it's a great idea, and they just fought themselves 23-year war against the French national movement, against Napoleon's spread of that movement, but at the same time they are now facing a huge problem. They are the only country that's gone through the Industrial Revolution. They have commercial interests that nobody else has. They need to have outlets for their industrial products. They need to prevent a revolution in their own country that could be what? Sparked by out of work thousands of people. If factories shut down, well, what keeps factories open? Open markets for the goods. Well, who's got open markets? What about people looking, what? To become a nation, to become free, to free themselves like all of Latin freaking America, like the Greeks against the Ottomans, like the Belgians against the Dutch. All these are potential market centers for British goods. And the British are now caught in a moral dilemma. Do we support these movements because they will purchase our products? Or do we support the concert of Europe and shut down the national movement, which is against our own best interest? Now, Britain is the only country to face this. It's the only country with an industrial revolution. It's the only country with hundreds of thousands of people employed in industrial factories. And if that culture and that sociological fabric is jostled because you can't sell your products, this can lead to riot, it can lead to strikes, it can lead to a lot of things. And they had a very stern warning about this that occurred in 1819. St. Peter's Field, Manchester, England, is an area where they produced a lot of textiles. Textiles for clothing, textiles to be shipped overseas. Stuff was piling up on the wharf, nothing's moving. People are being laid off, and they had a strike. The strike was to shut down the plant. So the textile workers in St. Peter's in Manchester went on strike. Thousands went to hear speeches, did picnics at the field, and the city of Manchester constabulary, as well as probably some kind of local militia, maybe made up of former members of the British Army, drew their swords, charged on horseback into crowds of men, women, and children that were there listening to speeches and having picnics. They dove into it. They killed quite a few people, injured quite a few, and the newspapers got a hold of it, and they called it, in derision of what had been the great victory of Waterloo, this is the Peterloo Massacre. Massacre of workers in St. Peter. How can a government that aspires to be so bright, democratic, ahead of the game with the mother of parliaments, do something as audacious and dastardly as kill its own people because they're on strike? Or attack them in a repressive, with such a repressive government that's so conservative, so terrified by the prospect of revolution that your own terror of it is going to bring it on. Surely Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was absolutely right. Britain was the monster that she wrote about in Frankenstein. The government is the monster. And so following riots like St. Peter's and repressive legislation called the Six Acts, the ACTS, the Six Acts, eventually the British workers said, enough of this BS, we're gonna challenge this. And they went on strike all over the country, and they finally got their way in 1832. We had the first reform bill in the country that revised that old 1 out of 350 get the right to vote. Now it's 1 out of 35. Who is now eligible to vote? managers, the owners of the mills, the owners of the factories. Then they couldn't even vote for it. But not the workers. Workers will eventually earn that right in 1867 with another reform bill. So you're looking at a country that's very repressive, very volatile, but ultimately, probably because of things like the Methodist Church that worked among the poor, that worked among the mill towns and so forth. Other conservative religious groups coming out of the Church of England. They're probably the reason, it's probably one of the main reasons, that Britain never went through a revolution. You don't have a French-style revolution, it certainly could have come. It was certainly eligible, like any standard. So the way the British are going to try to handle this, even though it never becomes a, let's say, revolt against the government, it's going to come about in two ways. The reform bills, they're going to slowly grant workers the right to vote, and the second thing is legislation dealing with foreign affairs like this, that's going to allow the British to have some flexibility in recognition of national groups in order that Britain might be able to sell their goods to these groups. So let's just start with the Greek Revolt of 1821. I love the Greeks because they're always fighting for civilization. They gave us democracy, and they still want Europe to pay for it today. I love them. It's the same now. We gave you civilization. I mean, it's hysterical. We just went through this, did we not? With the Greeks last year, with the Greeks. Anybody remember the Greeks? Their protestations about, because they owe the European Union like how many billions of drachma or euros. They're going belly up because their economy is based tourist based and bullshit. And so they decided that they were not going to pay the bill. And the Germans are demanding, God damn it, we loaned you the money, you're going to pay it. And you will enjoy it. And the Greeks said, we gave you democracy, we gave you civilization. And it's the same thing that came here. Exactly, 1821. They revolted against the Ottoman Empire. Now, if you look up here on the map, you can see this. I don't have a map pretty big on this slide. Right down here, this is 1914. This is, of course, years later, but I don't really want to carry it. This little area right here had a red line going through it to the south of the Peloponnesian area called Morea. And it's the Greek revolt against the Ottomans. 1821. Well, the Ottoman Empire said, well, thank you, no thank you, we're not going to support this. So they sent troops in. The Greeks were able to defend themselves against the Ottomans. But then the Ottomans called on their ally, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, and Ali sent an army in of 100,000 with 600 ships. The result was the Greeks began to lose very badly, and then the British stepped in and said, the Greeks gave us democracy, and the Greeks gave us civilization, because they've been talking about it. And they had speeches in London and speeches in Paris, and everybody's collecting money, and they're buying guns for the Greeks, and it becomes a real romantic national cause. All the British poets went down there, Byron, Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, they all went down, yay for the Greeks gave us all this, we've got to defend the Greeks. But if you look at British foreign policy, there's a couple things at stake here. And this is definitely going to show up as a question. British foreign policy is to keep the Ottoman Empire intact. Why? Because the Ottoman Empire is the key to the maintenance and control of the British Empire. The Middle East is basically the jugular vein of the British Empire. They don't own anything in the Middle East, but they control it informally through the Ottoman Empire. Keep the Ottoman Empire intact. Shit, there goes the Greeks. And if they break off from the Ottoman Empire and we let it happen, that's going to be the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of the end of our security system to control and protect the British Empire, especially the Asian side. Okay, that's number one. Secondly, every British schoolboy, as well as many, many kids on the continent, grew up with a classical education, the Renaissance classical education, which is what? The study of Greek and Latin, the study of the poets, the study of the Greeks. And so this is heroic romanticism about the Greeks that everybody's attracted to. So every schoolboy in Britain is going, God, you know, we've got to save the Greeks. So they're collecting money all over the country for this thing. And the British government says, we can't do that. We can't jump in and do that. We'd like to, but we can't. Because it violates our own basic interests, which means to protect the Ottoman Empire. And then another whole other problem comes up. Coming from the East is the big brother of the Greek. Greek people of this period. They're Orthodox Christians, Orthodox, not Catholic, not Protestant, Orthodox Christians, and they are a Slavic people. That puts them directly in the heart of every Slav's big Orthodox brother, that's Russia. Who was the hero in Russia that just defeated the Antichrist? Alexander I. Who's created the Holy Alliance? Alexander I. Who's going to jump in and save the Greeks? Alexander I. Where is he going with all this? He's going to get a warm water port finally. Where? The Black Sea. He's moving southwest into the Crimean Peninsula, the Black Sea, the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles Straits. So what you have to do is sort of put together both the strategic aspirations of the Russians, how that conflicts with the British attempt to preserve the Ottoman Empire, but it puts the Brits at odds. They're going to have to do something here, because if the Greek revolt continues, the Russians are going to get involved in the Balkans. Nobody in Europe at this time wants the Russians to get involved in the Balkans. Don't confuse the Balkans with the Baltic. People do that all the time. Now, the Russians threaten. For a while, however, it looks like the Greeks are taking care of themselves, and then comes the Ottomans' use of Muhammad Ali. Comes in with his army and his navy, and there's a slaughter of the Greeks at a place called Missolonghi. You don't need to write that down, but it's in this southern area. Lord Byron dies in battle at Missolonghi. Oh God, Lord Byron! It's the great romantic figure. You know, I mean, it's not quite the same thing as Jane Fonda dying in Vietnam. Don't get me wrong. I'm from that era that I still create a lot of gas when I think about that. Excuse me.
Lord Byron got sick and died.
That's what he did, but the initial reports were that he got shot. But and it's a big, yeah, it's a he did. Don't say that. Lord Byron actually died of malaria, but you know, it sort of leaked out that he got shot, and that sounds better. Okay. There's a monument to him there today, in Missolonghi. Others went there, they got sick, but you know, the whole thing is this romantic cause. But now the Brits are not because of the romanticism. That did drive them a bit. But now, because of the possible intervention of the Russians to defeat Muhammad Ali, the Brits are going to have to go in. And the Brits can never do anything just by themselves. They always seem to get backing from the French. I'm not sure why. There's some of these crazy adventures. Well, together with the French, they send a navy in the year 1827. They destroy Muhammad Ali's 600 ships. They capture much of his army on the Greek mainland. The war is over, and the Russians, the whole thing is to prevent the Russians from going in. But also, when it's over, you've got to preserve the principles of the Concert of Europe. How do you do this? You've got to give, now, part of the deal is, we're here to preserve legitimate government, legitimate monarchy. That's the concert. We can't support national ideas. So what they did, I mean, if you could, this formula is so bizarre. Here's Greece, and here's this part of Greece that rebelled. This part of Greece that rebelled became autonomous. Not independent, it's an autonomous part of the Ottoman Empire. Self-governing part of the Ottoman Empire. Well, who's running it? So, there's a lot of out-of-work kings running around the German states. Napoleon, governor of the old Holy Roman Empire, and all these guys are out of work. So he got a king. Constantine I. He's not a Greek, he's German. He speaks German. But they bring him anyway as a legitimate monarch to be placed on the new monarchy, not a republic, but a monarchy of Greece. They wanted to become a republic. They said, you can't do that. You've got to be a monarchy because monarchy fits with what we're trying to do. So they go through all these strange machinations to put together legitimate monarchy and how it doesn't violate the principles of the Concert of Europe.
The reason of the Greek flag is white and blue because of the Bavarian colors, because he was from Bavaria.
Yeah, he's Bavarian.
Yeah.
I was in Greece when he was overthrown.
Oh, really?
Not him, but
His monarchy.
son, yeah. Constantine the Ninth, I think. Not the original. It's been a long weekend, but it wasn't that long. Yeah.
Wasn't there like another overthrow during World War I during the Gallipoli campaign?
Gallipoli, World War I. Well, there's the Ottoman, not the Greeks. Greece was already independent by that time, and it was, they fought on the side of the Allies. They only came into the war about a year before the war ended in order to get territory, claim territory in Turkey. Is that what you're thinking about?
I just remember like there was a revolt against, never mind. All right, I'll find it.
Okay. So when this whole thing is over, you have this strange Ottoman Empire still preserved. That's the British philosophy. A small autonomous piece of Greece, which is run by a German king as legitimate monarchy. So the principles of legitimate government are preserved. There's no republic, there's no national movement. It's sort of swept under the table, and now Britain now has a market in Eastern Europe, the Greeks. So it's a market for British goods. Then comes a revolt in the Spanish colonies in Latin America. I won't go into big detail with this, but this is a rather amazing thing. Remember, the Spanish and the Portuguese both fought on the side of the British to overthrow Napoleon during the Peninsular War, from 1807 or 1808 up to 1815. They were faithful allies of the British in that period, and they had thousands of people killed in fighting Napoleon. They kept 300,000 French troops pinned down for about 7 years. Rather amazing situation. It was a horrible guerrilla warfare, but it nonetheless worked. They worked with Wellington, and they worked with Portuguese and Spanish together in this really gruesome war. Okay, so the British really owe the Portuguese and the Spanish something. Some form of union with all the issues that are happening after the war. Conflict here is that Spain's colonies begin to revolt, some of it based on the fact that we had had a successful revolution against England. And then Mexico went into revolt. under Hidalgo. Long struggle. Latin American colonies also begin to go into revolt. And a lot of British ex-soldiers became officers in the armies of Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, and so forth, to fight the Spanish. The British Navy becomes active in stopping Spanish ships from landing troops to stop these revolutions. These are national revolutions. So here we go again. This is your national movements. Does the British support the concert of Europe and help prevent nationalism? Or do they look after other interests? Their other interests, their greater interests are what? Trade, commerce, making money. And all the manufacturing materials that are rotting on the wharves of England, now we're going to have a place to go. We can sell them to Latin America. That's great news because Latin America has something nobody seems to have anything of, and that's plenty of silver and gold. And we don't have to wait for it's called the asiento, the assent of the Spanish government to trade. We can simply do it. So that's what they're trying to do. They're going to break into the trade by supporting the revolution. But it's a violation of the honor and the respect and the promises made to the Spanish and Portuguese government. It's a violation of the concert of Europe to do this. The Prime Minister of England at the time, Lord Canning, C-A-N-N-I-N-G, says, we call the New World to come to the redress of the Old World. And then he approached the United States about, how about joining together with us in preventing any future European colonization or attempt to retake these colonies? And the Americans, just having suffered the War of 1812 with the British, said to Canning, go fuck yourself. We're not doing anything with you. We don't trust you. We're going to proclaim our own American control and protection of the Western Hemisphere. We call it the Monroe Doctrine. That's it, Monroe Doctrine. We didn't have any ships. How are we going to proclaim? We did it. I love it. I love it. We just look. We work. We live on gas, ether, or something out there that gets into the American psyche sometimes, and we're just going to do it. Now, how are you going to? We don't know, but we're going to find a way. So Canning says, I can't worry about the Americans. He simply said, it's the British Navy that brought the New World into existence. We're protecting the New World against the Spanish reconquest or the Portuguese reconquest of Brazil. We'll just keep everybody out, but we'll have open trade with these guys, and man, have they got money. And they did, they had bullion. Tons of bullion. Just like, you know, be very nice with the Saudis because they have all they want. Be nice to these guys. Don't rouse, don't get mad, don't get them pissed off. So don't get the Argentines pissed off. I'm not sure why the British, during this whole program, decided to do something really stupid and seize the Falkland Islands. And Margaret Thatcher came back in 1980 and retook them after the second invasion of the Falklands. Strange, but Britain needed more places to raise sheep. Whatever. Sheep don't vote, and that's good. So out of this, you have this whole, it's the trade versus your own promises, your own foreign policy. How does it work? Okay. The last of these somewhat disingenuous moves was that Britain had been outsourcing work of the Industrial Revolution, outsourcing a lot of its work for lower pay. China was not yet available, but they're going to outsource it to Southern Holland. Population known as the Belgians. Spoke a different language, they didn't speak Dutch, they are Catholic. They supported the Spanish during the early wars, during the Reformation. Okay, during the Age of Religious Wars, all that's very, very different. They decided in the late 1820s to separate from the Dutch and declare their own state. Probably the British wouldn't have cared one way or the other, but the British had major, heavy financial interest in the southern part, in what we today call Belgium. Because it's the Belgians who took the outsourced work from the British factories and manufactured a lot of things under British patent to sell a lot cheaper, undercut anybody, because of the low wages. So as this was being done this way, the Dutch now, to prevent the revolution, to stop the nationalist movement, sent their navy in to blockade many of the Belgian areas, places like Antwerp and so forth. And it was very stiff. The fighting was very heavy. It's very intense. This is a nationalist movement. The British Navy now comes in to support the Belgians. In 1830, 31, 32, they blockaded the Dutch and the Dutch military from seizing Belgian territory and taking it back in. The result is that by 1832, the British forced an agreement on the Dutch that Belgium would become independent. It's a nationalist movement. You're doing it again. You did it with the Greeks. You did it with Latin America. Now you're doing it here. Why can't anybody trust the Brits? So the Brits developed this reputation of being very untrustworthy. And there's a term that's used about Britain at the time. Britain is always in a period of splendid isolation. Splendid isolation means nobody likes you. Nobody trusts you. And it happens because you keep acting only in your own interest. You're not supporting the concert of Europe. You're not supporting the general peace. You seem to say yes, but then you do something else. And this is the last damn straw. Belgian independence. So in order to appease everybody in Europe, the British said, okay, this new Belgium, first of all, what was the fear? The fear was if Belgium becomes an independent country separate from Holland, they're going to be absorbed by France and give France another chance in building empire. It's going to be a real problem. Or it could create another general European war. But what if Belgium is going to be neutral? Written in its constitution is to be a neutral country, cannot join any alliance, cannot join with the French, can never join with the German states or anybody else. And that neutrality would be guaranteed by Great Britain. That's a different story. Britain says, we'll do that. We'll recognize Belgium as an independent country, but as a neutral. It can never join any alliance or any side in any European conflict. That neutrality is maintained until July of 1914, actually August of 1914, when Germany began to march through Belgium, violated Belgian neutrality. And ironically, that's what brought Britain into World War I. It was not the war on France. It was not the war of Russia versus Germany. It was the fact that Germany violated Belgian neutrality in violation of the Treaty of 1832. Britain is the guarantor, the one who guarantees that neutrality. So all this is all this sort of strange political diplomatic history that makes Europe such a strange place in the 19th century. You've got these little wars you've got these small revolutions. You also have 3 revolutionary periods, which I'll discuss very briefly. So you've got these conflicts, you've got British interest here, Britain is going its own direction. And I'll just finish with one thing about the Brits, the internal problem with Britain. Because of the Industrial Revolution and overcrowding, you have what we call Britain in the age of Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens wrote about the Brits from about the 1840s up to the 1860s. And all the stories that he writes were meant for serials, for publication. And they were not sort of meant to be cute little stories, as they turn out to be, in a very quaint kind of, say, re-examination of a lot of what Dickens wrote. It's always about the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-not, the horrible condition of the factory workers, the horrible condition of society as a whole. Dickens wasn't kidding about this. Britain had become a nightmare. The average lifespan in Britain at the time had gone back to 40 years of age, meaning that it had slipped because of the Industrial Revolution. The average British worker worked in these new industrial towns. They were now off their farms by a long ways. They were forced off their farms by the enclosure laws, increase of the enclosure laws in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. They could not get a decent meal or food because of the corn laws that existed at the time. Corn laws meant that the corn price of grain in Britain was kept artificially high due to price manipulation to keep importers out of Britain, keep American imports out of Britain, keep Russian imports out of Britain, keep foreign wheat out of Britain, to keep British prices artificially high. We know that's still being done in some places. That's always a killer, and therefore people could not afford the food. Average worker works 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, and 1 day off. The worst were the steel mills or the iron mills, and then probably a little less nasty were the textile mills and the silk mills where kids worked. There were no unions. Unions were not allowed. And you lived in row houses that were built very, very shoddily, put up right away, to be right next to the factories. Row house had roughly 25 to 30 apartments in it per row house. Each apartment held roughly 10 people. You have 3 or 4 families sharing a row house. Water ran 3 hours a day, 3 days a week in a central courtyard. That's where you had to get your buckets of water. You did everything with that water. You took your bath, you drank, you cooked with it, everything. 3 hours a day, 3 days a week. That's it. That was the municipal water system. No toilets. So people defecated and urinated in between the row houses or in the back, general area. You had the cholera epidemics constantly. People were constantly sick. TB was rampant. The Thames River was one just totally polluted. Sickness coming out of that all the time. Really terrible conditions. When you have two things happen here, big things. This involves billions of people. At the time you have, prostitution was rampant. At the time in England there were, as far as we know, about 7,000 professional prostitutes in the cities, 7,000 pros. But you also had something like 71,000 part-timers who worked in the factories the other hours. And this they did to get extra money. Especially if women worked in the factories and they were injured, there was no compensation, no workman's compensation.
There's no such thing as a minimum wage, it was always minimum, count on that. Paid Walmart with golden. And in the same token, you have, people try to make the extra money with prostitution, it was everywhere. For the men, the biggest problem was drinking. In London alone, in one area of London, you have almost 8,000 what might be politely called pubs. They were gin houses where you drank cheap gin, and you went in for one reason only, and that's just to get drunk, period. You didn't get in there to socialize, nobody socialized, you just wanted to forget the day. 6 days a week, 16 hours a day, you better think you're gonna forget the day. So this is rampant, and alcoholism was everywhere. Little kids were heavy drinkers, and society was just basically a total wreck. When Dickens talked about that England, it was pretty grim. The children born to the prostitutes, born to illegitimate women, carrying the child, might be a factory worker, might be an injury factory worker, might be a professional prostitute, it didn't matter. Nobody wanted to have these children. So the result was you had just thousands of abortions going on all the time. And if they could. But it really wasn't abortion because nobody really performed it. There's always the recognition by the medical profession and the church that that sort of thing doesn't really, we don't allow that. Okay, fine. Well, what do? You get the child out of the womb, and you take that child or the fetus or whatever, and you put it out to exposure, or you throw it in the Thames. You just do what you have to do. It's absolute killing. That's what it was. That's the way they handled it. Other times, some mothers would actually try to get their kids to have the baby and to keep the baby alive some fashion. And they try to bring wet nurses down from the countryside for milk, because typically these mothers did not have any milk. So they brought the baby, they brought the wet nurses down. It wasn't enough. And so what they did was take these children to the convents or to church stations, where you would have a wall built around it, where they would try to take over almost like miniature orphanages to raise these children. And when they try to raise the children, they would take a little, come to the wall, doing the same thing in France too. When you came to the wall where the convent was located, or where the church facility was located, there was an opening in that thing. You pull the drawer out, and you take the baby, and you wrap the baby up in the baby clothes, whatever you have, give it a name, and give it a little thing, remembrance of who you are. You pin that to the baby, and you shove it through the wall. It comes out on the other side, and a nun or a priest or a church worker, depending on which denomination it was, will take the baby and try to raise the baby, give it artificial feed. It's kind of a malt drink that they made at the time. Mostly that killed kids. It just burst their stomachs. When I was in London, spent a year there about 15 years ago. I was near where one of those facilities was located, called Gresham Fields, and it still had all the graveyards where all these little kids are buried, and all this stuff. And we had all this little museum there where they had the medals that the parents left and mothers left and so forth. They would put a little note on the kid saying, "This is baby Marie," or "This is baby Robbie," or whatever. God bless it. And shove it in, and she'd never see the baby again. This was the one way out. That was not the same thing as killing the kid. But the same token, how many of those children survived? Maybe 1 in 10, because of the blight here, and because of disease and so forth. Clearly, England at the time of the Industrial Revolution, as the spotlight of the world and the mother of parliaments and all that good stuff, was a pretty bleak place. And probably more bleak than just about anywhere else I could think of. I would not want to be there in the middle of the 19th century. So that system is going to have to change. And
part of the changes come about with the Foreign Bill of 1832, which improves some of the workers' situations. You're gonna start having shorter work hours, you're gonna have the recognition of labor unions. But what comes out of this also, you have unionism come out of it, you have socialism come out of it, you have Bolshevism or communism come out of it. These are all responses to a very irresponsible capitalist society that doesn't give a shit about its people. And you know, there are reasons that unions exist. There's a reason that socialist parties exist. There's even a reason this communist party exists. They didn't come out of a vacuum. They came out of very specific issues dealing with abuse of labor for a long period of time where the government was not responsible. And you kind of smell that situation in that sort of, again, one sees it or feels it coming back again. But anyway, that's Britain in the 19th century. Ultimately, the British are going to begin to find a way out of some of this by legislation, by recognizing union, also by creating laws that limit the amount of labor, that limit the age of the labor, and so forth. But it's still going to be bleak for a long time. Slowly, what begins to bring people into greater health was the fact that some of the industry that Britain was maintaining was the creation of the canning industry, which begins to put products away that people can store and then have later, and then can actually eat. And also, the enactment of the anti-corn league laws. Once you get rid of the corn laws that protect local farmers from selling at high prices, and you allow American and Russian wheat into Britain, which they finally did, and German wheat as well. Once that happens, you've broken that monopoly, and you begin to see people be able to afford better food, live longer, and so forth. All right. Any questions? Has this been a bleak lecture or what? I'm so depressed. Yeah. Well, some questions.
Why did England take such a very aggressive stance against the like slavery in 1805 and just having huge like naval ship patrols?
They didn't have to be responsible for it. This was done by a group of evangelicals coming out of the Church of England. Wakefield was one. Pitt actually was another very strong supporter of this. The All Talents Ministry of 1807, which was right during the Peace of Amen, was a mixed bag English ministry. But they had a moral agenda, and the moral agenda was to stop the slave trade. They stopped it as far as the British were concerned. One of the things they wanted to try and do was enforce it through the Congress of Europe and make sure it did not revive after the war was over, because everybody wanted to get it. Slave trade was so lucrative that everybody wanted to get involved with. Everybody was involved with it still, including the British. So their idea was to try to put if we win this war and we defeat Napoleon, we cannot let this one evil that we know is really evil continue. And so there's a lot of moral, I'd say, really moral pressure put on British leaders and the congressmen at Vienna to try and find a way to stop the slave trade. And slave trade legislation finally was signed on by all the European powers. It was fairly effective. They tried to enforce it in the East as well. East Africa, Persian Gulf, Red Sea, that area, because a lot of slavery was coming into British India. And the Navy in that part of the station in India was not the British Navy per se, but it's called the Bombay Marine. It's a subsidiary of the British Navy. And they actually flew the old Mughal Empire flag in the ship. It's pretty bizarre. There's so much bizarre stuff going on here. They are the ones that are given the job to task of stopping the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. They didn't want to do it, they didn't want to have to do it, they didn't like doing it, because when you stop the slave trade, it means that some of the states that are receiving the slaves are gonna resort to something else, such as what? It's either slave trade or piracy. So you stop the slave trade, you got piracy on your hands. Stop piracy, you go back to the slave trade. So the Bombay Marines said, this is nuts, we can't keep doing this. And so finally, the British government took it out of their hands, and decided to enforce it directly from London, rather than from Bombay. And it still took them 30 years to get it all done. So it's very tough, especially with a lot of the agents for the slave trade were British, operating in the Indian Ocean. That's why they didn't want to do it. So it's a no thank you sort of deal. Okay, we're gonna start up on Wednesday. We're gonna start talking about what is going wrong in Europe. We have a lot of peace going on here. Peace could be a good thing, but you've got some small wars, but eventually they start talking about what's going on, what's leading up to the First World War. What brings that about? And I'd like you to do some reading on that, let's get into English heritage. Read about the coming of the First World War, how Britain's alliances lined up, and we'll talk about the spread of colonialism, which is one of the agents that leads up to the war. And so enjoy yourselves, and see you Wednesday.